Have you ever looked at the 65-inch and 98-inch versions of the same TV and wondered if the bigger one actually looks better, or if you're just paying for more glass? Hi, I'm Alex from Ratings.com, and over the last few months, we bought and tested multiple big screen versions of popular TVs and compared them directly to their 65-inch counterparts: Sony's BRAVIA 5, TCL's QM8K, Hisense's U8QG, and Samsung's QN80F, plus the massive Hisense 98QD5QG that only comes in a 98-inch size. All of these are 4K TVs, so on paper, you might expect the picture to simply scale up, but in our testing, that wasn't always the case. By the end of this video, you'll know when a bigger TV actually gives you better image quality, when it doesn't, and what trade-offs you should expect if you're thinking about jumping from something like a 65-inch to a wall-filling 98 or 100 inches. Before we talk about each TV, it helps to understand what can change when you scale a 4K TV up. The resolution stays the same, but the pixels get physically larger, and you have a lot more screen area to light up. So that means more backlight, more local dimming zones, and more power draw. Manufacturers sometimes keep the same basic panel across all sizes, like TCL does on the QM8K, and sometimes they change the backlight or color system and tweak the dimming layout on the largest size, like we saw on the 100-inch Hisense U8QG. Bigger also exaggerates issues if you keep the same seating distance. Viewing angles matter more because the sides of the screen are physically further off axis from where you're sitting, so color and contrast changes show up sooner. Local dimming artifacts like blooming or zone transitions are easier to spot because each halo is larger, and you're staring at more black bars and dark corners. If you move your couch back in line with our recommended size to distance ratio, a lot of that evens out, but the bigger TV still costs more and uses more power, sometimes more than double. So with that all in mind, let's run through what we actually saw on each of the big models we tested. Starting with the Sony BRAVIA 5, the 98-inch version isn't just a bigger copy of the 65-inch, it's genuinely the better TV. In our contrast tests, both sizes had almost identical white levels around 200 nits, but the 98-inch drove the black floor down from about 0.0038 nits to 0.002. That nearly doubles the contrast ratio and makes blacks look roughly 47% deeper in a dark room. You can see the difference on real content with deep shadows and small highlights. Brightness is also clearly in the 98-inch's favor. Across HDR window tests, the 98-inch can be up to 400 nits brighter than the 65-inch, and it sits near 1000 nits on many mid-size windows. The smaller size peaks around 800 nits, so it relies on tone mapping more often for 1000 nit HDR masters. In SDR, the 98-inch is roughly 190 nits brighter in our real scene test, which helps a lot in bright rooms. At 1000 nits, the 98-inch covers nearly 9% more of the DCI-P3 HDR color space, mainly at the bright end, so saturated colors stay vivid at higher luminance. Then there's motion. The 98-inch has much faster pixel response times than the 65-inch. At 120 Hz, near black transitions are significantly quicker, so dark motion smearing is greatly reduced. You do get more overshoot and a bit more inverse ghosting, but overall, motion looks noticeably sharper, especially in games. The trade-offs are straightforward. The 98-inch is far more expensive and uses over twice the power during normal streaming, hovering around 430 to 450 watts. You need a big room and you'll pay for that giant backlight on your electric bill. But if you have the space and the budget, the 98-inch BRAVIA 5 is the clear winner in this pair. The TCL QM8K is almost the opposite story. Here, TCL did a great job keeping the 65 and 98-inch versions effectively identical. Under the hood, the panels are nearly the same. Spectral power distribution and pixel structure match closely, and both sizes use TCL's WHVA panel for better viewing angles than a typical VA. In HDR, brightness is a mixed bag, but the differences are tiny. The 98-inch is a bit brighter in some sustained tests, while the 65-inch hits slightly higher peaks on some larger windows. In real scenes, we're talking about differences of just a few percent, which you won't see unless you're doing a side-by-side measurement. Contrast is effectively identical, with both sizes reaching very deep blacks thanks to dense mini LED dimming. Color volume is also basically the same. The 65-inch has a hair more coverage in some lighter shades, but both live well within normal unit-to-unit variants and look equally vivid in person. The main difference is viewing angle. The 98-inch loses color saturation off-axis sooner and more aggressively. Color washout and shift happen at smaller angles, and that matters on a 98-inch because the sides of the screen are already off axis, even from the middle of a couch if you sit close. The larger size does a slightly better job keeping blacks from lifting off angle, but overall, the 65-inch gives you better off-axis color. So, with the QM8K, going bigger really is about immersion, seating distance, and budget. The 65 and 98-inch models look so similar in most metrics that you should mostly pick based on how big a screen your room can handle and how much you want to spend. The Hisense U8QG tells an entirely different story. Here, the 100-inch version is actually a downgrade from the 65-inch. Both sizes use VA panels, but the way they create color is different. The 65-inch uses a traditional narrow-band quantum dot layer for both green and red, which gives very tight color peaks. The 100-inch mixes in a KSF red phosphor instead, which is cheaper and a bit broader, so its reds and overall color separation aren't quite as precise. In HDR brightness tests, the 100-inch is a bit dimmer across most windows. We're usually seeing a 10 to 15% drop in peak and sustained brightness compared to the 65-inch. With real scenes, that gap can grow because the two sizes track the PQ curve differently. Both are still extremely bright and can deliver very impactful HDR, but if you compare them directly, the smaller set has a bit more headroom. Color volume is also better on the 65-inch. The 100-inch loses roughly 6% of SDR and HDR coverage, mostly in reds and greens. Again, both TVs are so colorful that most people won't even notice unless you put them side by side with very specific content. But technically, the larger one is weaker here. On the bright side, local dimming performance and black levels are very similar, and both sizes remain excellent for movies and games. The bigger one just doesn't build on the 65-inch in the same way Sony's 98-inch BRAVIA 5 does. It's more like same idea, slightly cheaper panel, and a touch less brightness at the largest size. So, with the U8QG, you're trading a bit of color and brightness for sheer size. Both are great TVs, but the 65-inch is the better performer. The 100-inch is for people who prioritize screen size over those small but noticeable quality differences. The Samsung QN80F sits somewhere in the middle. When we compared the 65-inch QN80F to the 100-inch, the bigger one stood out for its brightness. It's quite a bit brighter overall, especially in HDR, so highlights look more vivid, and it fights glare better in bright rooms. The trade-off is local dimming. The 100-inch has worse dimming behavior, with more haloing around bright objects and a less precise backlight overall. You get more glow around subtitles and UI on dark backgrounds than on the 65-inch, and the set as a whole is not as refined as some other ultra-large mini LEDs in the market. So, if you buy the 100-inch QN80F, you're effectively trading cleaner dark room performance for extra brightness and size. If you mostly watch during the day in a bright living room, the 100-inch's light output may be worth it. If you care about subtle black detail and dim lighting, the 65-inch version is the safer choice. The fifth big TV in this story, the Hisense U8QG, doesn't have a smaller twin to compare against, but it's worth mentioning because it shows what happens when a manufacturer focuses almost entirely on size and price. The 98QD5QG is one of the cheapest 98-inch TVs you can buy, and it looks appealing on a spec sheet. 4K resolution, 144Hz panel, 2 HDMI 2.1 ports, VRR, and Google TV. But there's no local dimming at all, and the IPS type panel has very low native contrast. Blacks look gray even in the modest lighting, HDR brightness is poor, and highlights barely stand out. So movies and games look flat. On the plus side, it has a wide viewing angle and a matte screen with great handling of direct reflections, so it's usable in a moderately bright room. But once the novelty of a 98-inch screen wears off, you're left with underwhelming image quality. In our recommendations, we usually tell people that if they want a huge TV with good picture quality, they're better off spending more for something like TCL's QM6K. This model is a good reminder that big and cheap often means big compromises. Looking across all of these tests, a few patterns show up. First, size by itself doesn't guarantee better performance. One of the big models is clearly better in the 98-inch BRAVIA 5, one is essentially the same with the 98-inch QM8K, one is a mild downgrade in the 100-inch U8QG, the 100-inch QN80F trades brightness for worse dimming, and lastly, one is just a giant budget option with poor picture quality with the Hisense 98QD5QG. Second, manufacturers sometimes change panel tech or tuning at the largest sizes. The U8QG swaps to cheaper quantum dots. Sony tunes the 98-inch BRAVIA 5 to be faster and brighter, and Hisense's 98QD5QG is a completely different, non-dimming design than the U8QG, even though they share a brand. TCL's QM8K is the exception, where the big and small sizes really do behave like the same TV. Third, big screens amplify everything if you sit at the same distance. A little blooming is much more obvious stretched across 100 inches. Slight color washout off-axis on a 65-inch can turn into a real issue when the sides of a 98-inch are already off-axis from your seat. If you follow our recommended size-to-distance ratio and sit farther back, those effects are less noticeable. But uniformity problems like dirty screen effect or dim corners are still easier to spot, and power draw always scales up hard. Finally, the non-picture trade-offs are consistent. Bigger TVs are heavier, more expensive to ship and mount, and they demand a longer viewing distance. Going from 65 to 98 inches more than doubles screen area and pushes the recommended cinema distance seating from roughly 6.5 feet to almost 10. If your room is small, you simply may not be able to sit far enough back for a 98 or 100 inch to feel comfortable. So, should you buy the biggest size of a TV you're considering? If it's something like Sony's BRAVIA 5, the 98-inch really does give you better picture quality in addition to the larger image, as long as you're okay with the cost and power draw. If it's something like TCL's QM8K, the 65 and 98-inch perform so similarly that you should choose based on room size and price, not picture quality. If it's more like the Hisense U8QG or Samsung Q80F, the largest size comes with trade-offs in color, dimming, or both, so you need to really value the extra size to justify those compromises. And if it's a bargain giant like the Hisense 98QD5QG, you're mostly paying for square inches, not image quality. The big takeaway from our testing is that you shouldn't assume the 100-inch version of a TV is just the best version of that TV. Treat every size as its own product. Check how the panel, brightness, and dimming change, and then decide if the extra immersion is worth the money, the power, and the space in your room. That's it for our recap of the 5 big TVs we've reviewed lately. So, what do you think? Would you like to see us review more big TVs? If you want to talk about it with us directly, we're now on Discord. We're active in the chat, so feel free to drop your questions or feedback there too. Just head to discord.gg/ratings to join, or click the link in the description below. And make sure to drop by our website for more performance data, photos, and the whole suite of results. Until next time, I'm Alex from Ratings.com, where we help you find the best product for your needs.